Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Wednesday, July the 5th, 2023. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thanks for joining. On tonight's show, government is not the solution to inflation, it's the main cause. But before we get into that whole discussion, as always, I'd like to take a few minutes talking about some of the headlines that came to my attention today that caught my eye that I thought might be of some interest to you. So, the escalating battle between Ottawa, the federal government, and Facebook's other platforms, Instagram, etc., collectively known now as Meta. They changed their name. I'm not really sure why they felt it was important to change the brand, but they did that. So, the federal government has announced today that it is suspending its advertising on all of Facebook's platforms. Between 2020 and 2022, according to federal government sources, they spent somewhere in the order of $23 million on ads on Facebook and Instagram. That was nearly triple, by the way, what they paid for ads on Twitter or Snapshot, $6.7 million and $5 million respectively. And also on Wednesday, Quebec's largest media conglomerate, Quebecor, which, by the way, owns newspapers, Le Journal de Montréal and Le Journal du Québec, as well as TVA news stations, announced that they would also be pulling advertising off of the Meta platforms as long as the company refuses to host Canadian news links. And of course, Facebook, Meta, was the first big tech company to suspend the news links, allowing news links on their platform that would take you to websites for the news content providers here in Canada. And all of this stems from Bill C-18, which passed into law recently, and that is the federal law that requires, although we don't know what the mechanism for this is yet, but requires these large tech companies to pay news content providers in Canada for access to their news. Now, we've talked about this before. I still don't get it. I'm still waiting for somebody to explain to me why it's so important to pick a fight with Facebook, because when you post a link on Facebook to a news story, to any news story in Canada, you're taken to the website of the company that's providing that news story. Unless somebody's cutting and pasting, that's a different thing altogether. But that doesn't often happen. Usually you cut and paste a link into a Facebook posting, and people then click on that link, and it takes you to the website of the news provider. And the news provider gets paid by advertisers for that visit. That's how they sell their advertising online. So I'm not sure what the problem here is, why the government feels that it's necessary to try to raid, if you want to use that term, Facebook. But that's actually not the point that I really want to make right now. The point that I really want to make right now is this, between 2020 and 2022, the federal government spent $23 million on ads on Facebook and Instagram combined. Well, for the first quarter of 2023, Facebook, Meta, reported revenues of $28.65 billion US. That's $38 billion Canadian in one quarter. Look, I understand that you want to stand on principle. I guess I still, again, I said I don't really understand why this is such a big deal, but what I can tell you is this. If you expect that the Canadian government is going to bully Facebook into doing anything, guess again. Okay, trust me, Facebook can do without the Canadian government advertising. Okay, grocery rebates here. Checks being mailed today. If you qualify for a grocery rebate in Canada, then you can expect either the direct deposit into your account if you have that arrangement with the federal government with the CRA, or you can expect a check in the mail over the course of the next few days. How much is the rebate? Well, you could receive, if you are a couple with 2 children, you could receive, depending on your household income, as much as $467. If you're single without children, again, depending on your income, you could receive up to $234. And of course, seniors, again, depending on income, can receive up to an extra $225. So, my question, of course, is this really supposed to help? I mean, of course, every dollar that comes into your pocket in this day and age is helpful in one form or another, but this is a one-time payment. And we're going to get into a discussion about this as we move forward in the show as to whether or not this actually helps inflation or actually helps to create it. So you don't want to miss that. Canada's inflation rate, according to Statistics Canada, slowed to 3.4% in May, but grocery prices continued to rise rapidly. Prices up 9% over a year ago, from a year ago today. Cold case solved. Once again, the police come through. The OPP, that's Ontario's provincial police, reported that they had learned as late as 2020 the name of the victim whose body was found in the Nation River in Castleman, Ontario, which is not too far from where we're broadcasting from, in 1975. She was a 48-year-old woman by the name of Jewel Parchman Langford, a businesswoman from Tennessee who was visiting Canada at the time when she was abducted and strangled, and her body was tossed off a bridge from Highway 417, again, right near where we're living, into the Nation River. So her body was finally identified. She was a Jane Doe for a long time, but also apparently they have been able to identify a suspect and charge him now with murder. Rodney Nichols, who is a former resident of Montreal, who knew Langford, has now been identified. Nichols today lives in Florida and is currently the subject of an extradition request to have him come back up to Canada to face a murder charge. In international news, ladies and gentlemen, rioting in France. We haven't really talked about this before, but over the past number of days, about a week, there's been a lot of rioting in France, ostensibly in reaction to the shooting by a police officer of a 17-year-old in suburban Paris. A lot of people talking about this being, another one of these Black Lives Matter types of protests. And maybe to a certain degree, there is an element of that. These kinds of accusations of police not caring or being discriminatory against individuals, immigrants, descendants of immigrants, that's an ongoing thing. France, of course, is not as stable a democracy as everybody seems to think it is. They go through these crazy fits of public unrest from time to time. And it's important to remember that, we have, since the French Revolution, had a number of iterations of the French Republic. I believe we're in the 5th Republic right now. So it's not the first time that this kind of thing has happened. France is not going to collapse. It's not burning. It's a big country. The cities where you see the small videos of cars on fire or looting, etc., it's not pretty, but it's fairly isolated still. What's really interesting about this story, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that of the 3,354 people who have been arrested over the past week, as of today, the average age of the protesters was 17 years old. This is according to the Interior Ministry of France, who also pointed out that children as young as 12 or 13 years old have been detained for attacking law enforcement and setting fires. You know, this is much more than just protesting against police discrimination against immigrants. Whether that's true or not is beside the point. When you have 12 and 13-year-olds participating in this kind of thing, attacking law enforcement, looting, setting cars on fire, that's a whole different category of civil unrest. And you have to ask yourself, as the government in France is now doing, where are the parents of these children that they would allow their kids to participate in such vile and violent acts? And the looting. I mean, how do you hold people, just private citizens? Why do you hurt private citizens by destroying their property, by stealing their goods if they happen to be in business selling things on a street corner? It's outrageous. And nobody should give these guys a pass. It's hooliganism, regardless of whatever the justification originally was for expressing some degree of dissatisfaction or unhappiness with police action. I don't know whether or not the accusations made against the police in France are accurate. I suspect that they're exaggerated, but whatever. It's not justification for the kind of violence that we're seeing, any more than the police killing a black man in the United States is justification for the kind of wanton violence and destruction that we witnessed in the United States a couple of years ago. Moving on, we should have known that this was going to happen at some point in time. The Taliban in Afghanistan, yes, that country that we in Canada and the United States and other countries in the West shed blood in liberating the people of Afghanistan. Now the Taliban are back in charge again, and they have recently banned beauty salons for women in that unfortunate country. A spokesman for the Taliban-run Virtue and Vice Ministry, Mohammed Siddiq Akif Mahajar, wasn't giving details on the ban. He only confirmed that there had been a letter that was circulating on social media, which is actually kind of funny when you think about it, because, I don't know, it's really hard to control social media. Anyway, apparently the letter issued on June 24th said that it was conveying a verbal order from the supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada. The ban targets the capital of Kabul and all provinces, and it gives salons throughout the country a month's notice to wind down their businesses. After that period, they have to close, and they have to submit a report about their closure to the government. See, even in Afghanistan, which has gone right back to the Stone Age, the bureaucracy still rules. Not only do you have to shut down your beauty salon, but you have to file a report about your shutting down the beauty salon. The release, by the way, by the government in Afghanistan comes just days after the supreme leader claimed that his government has taken all of the necessary steps for the betterment of women's lives in his country. We reported yesterday about an AP story, the discovery of a white powder substance in the White House. Turns out that the substance was cocaine, and now apparently bookmakers have listed Hunter Biden as the favorite source of the White House cocaine. I don't know whether that's, I don't know whether he's the source or not, but it's interesting when people are betting that he is. Poor Hunter Biden. Okay, and yesterday, just a final note here, yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, reported on riders who were trapped upside down on a roller coaster at the Forest County Festival in Crandon, Minnesota. Turns out I was wrong, and in keeping with my wanting to be accurate and my principle of wanting to be right instead of consistent, Crandon is not in Wisconsin. It's not in Minnesota. It is in Wisconsin. So the story was accurate, except I placed Crandon in the wrong U.S. state. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that is the headlines for tonight. So we are going to go for our break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about government not being really the solution to our inflation problems, but rather being the cause. So stay tuned for that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on The Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Ronald Reagan, former president of the United States, the late Ronald Reagan, once said, rather famously, that the 9 most feared words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And it's particularly apropos that we recall those words in view of the fact, as we reported earlier, that the federal government here in Canada is now sending out its grocery rebate checks or making a direct deposit into people's accounts up to 11 million Canadians. That's more than a quarter of the entire population, children, babies, infants included. 11 million people or so are qualifying for this rebate. And the whole premise of the rebate is that the government has to do something to help people to afford their groceries in an era of high, particularly food inflation. As I mentioned earlier in the show, inflation seems to be coming down now in most areas, but on food, 9% year over year we're sitting at right now. That's significant. Now, the reason why I have such criticism of what the government is doing here is twofold. The first is, let's just get it off our chest and set it aside, because it's not really the subject of what I want to talk about. But can we please all agree that sending out a check for $400, a one-time payment for a family of four, that is a couple with two children, and that, my friends, is the maximum that you qualify for if you happen to be a low-income Canadian, low household income, a little over $400. So you qualify for the $400, you get this check, you can spend it on anything you want. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. But the whole idea is that we want to help people make ends meet when it comes to groceries. Does this really accomplish that? I don't think it does. I think it's rather insulting that the bureaucracy in Ottawa has come to the conclusion that all we have to do is send out this check, and somehow or other everybody's going to be very pleased. They're going to be able to make ends meet. So to me, it's a nonsensical gesture. It's nothing more than a form of virtue signaling, which this government under this prime minister have turned into a sublime art form. But let's set aside that criticism for a few minutes here. It's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the inflation aspect of this. And I want to start off by telling you a story. The story is going back to the 1970s and early 80s, when we in the Western countries were experiencing a significant period of inflation and unemployment, not unlike what we're seeing today. Except inflation was higher, it was more persistent, it had lasted for several years, and unemployment was much higher as well. We don't seem to be having quite the unemployment problem today that we had back then. In that period of time, there was a couple of things that happened, and I have personal knowledge of this because I was involved in some of the goings-on in private business at that time. The federal government had, at that time, what was known as a federal sales tax. Now, if you're in Canada, and you know about the GST, that's the federal sales tax, goods and services tax, unless you happen to be in one of the provinces where they have harmonized the federal sales tax with an existing provincial tax, in which case it's the HST, which stands for harmonized sales tax. But whether it's GST at 5% or harmonized sales tax, which is whatever the amount of the provincial tax plus the federal 5% portion, all of that didn't exist until 1991 or 92, I think it was. But the federal government still collected sales taxes. And that's the point that I want to make here. The point I want to make is that the federal government was collecting sales tax long before it created and implemented the GST. So if you're from Canada, it's important you understand that. All right, when I'm talking about the federal sales tax at that time, I'm not talking about the GST. And we're going to explain in a few minutes why it's important to know the difference. The federal sales tax was on goods and services that were, goods predominantly. It was also known as a manufacturer sales tax. So what would happen is the federal government imposed a sales tax on manufactured goods as they were leaving the plant. So if you were a wholesaler or a retailer who was purchasing from the manufacturer would charge you X percent, whatever the federal tax was, very similar to what happens now with the GST, but it was done at the manufacturing level. So the manufacturer would charge you the tax, and the wholesaler or the retailer would pay the tax, and the manufacturer would remit it to the federal government. The consumer, the end user, the end buyer of whatever the product was, never saw that tax because it wasn't charged at at retail. But guaranteed, ladies and gentlemen, okay, if you don't take anything away from today's talk, other than this, if this is the only thing that you remember from today's discussion, from today's topic, if this is the only thing you remember, then you're doing really well, because this is critical. Consumers pay taxes. Corporations don't pay taxes. Corporations might charge the tax, they might remit the tax, they might do all of the administrative work around the tax, but in the final analysis, it's you, the consumer, that pays that tax, even if you don't see it. And that's what was happening at that time. The federal government was charging tax, but it wasn't showing up in the retail portion as an item, but people were still paying the tax because it was just passed on as part of the price of the product. Now, what does all this have to do with inflation? Well, there are different types of inflation, but let's just stick with the most common basic understanding. Escalation in prices. Escalation in prices. Okay? You see the price going up? That's inflation. At least that's the way the federal government works. Prices going up, it's inflation. Except that, and going back to the story that I was telling you, that at that time, because the federal government was so starved for funds, one of the areas where they were able to increase taxes, to increase their revenue, was their sales tax, which people didn't really understand that they were paying. Most people didn't know, they just didn't realize they were paying it. And I saw in the field that I was working in, mechanical contracting, engineering, and energy production, that the federal government had increased its tax over the course of about a year, for instance, from 5% on whatever the goods were coming out of the manufacturer to approximately 12%. Okay, so 11, 12%, depending on what the product was. More than doubling the amount of money that was being collected at the manufacturer level. That wasn't just passed on in a net sort of way to the consumer. I guarantee you that if retailers had to pay that, which they did, they would put a markup on it as well. So let's say that the retailer would take a product and let's just say, for the sake of easy math, that when the retailer purchased that product from the manufacturer, that they paid a 10% tax on it. Now, it's not unusual for some retail products that when you sell them to the consumer, you double the price. That's not unusual. It's not a standard, but it's not unusual. I'm using that just now as an example. And by the way, nobody should think that retailers are just gouging you by doubling the price that they paid for something, because retailers have all kinds of other things that they have to pay. Not just rent and heat and hydro and all of that stuff and salaries, but they have to pay their own taxes as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Just for the sake of illustrating, getting back to the story though, retailers who might, to make the math easy, just simply double the price that they paid on the product that they're selling. If they paid 10% tax, that meant that the consumer, without seeing that tax as an item on their receipt when they paid, were paying, yes, 20% tax on that product. And of course, the prices would go up. Every time the federal government increased its price, the price would go up. And of course, this applies to other taxes and other fees that companies have to pay. Whenever the federal government feels that it needs to increase its revenue, it imposes other taxes. A famous one that people didn't seem to understand was the health tax in Ontario. You and I live in Ontario. We used to pay for our health insurance. It was a publicly administered program, but we had to, as individuals, pay a fee, an insurance fee, every year. 4 times a year, if I recall correctly, we paid a fee. That's how we funded healthcare in Ontario. Along came the government and decided that rather than charging you and I, consumers, for our healthcare coverage, that they would make companies responsible for this. But it never showed up in as an item in anybody's bill. That was the health tax. And then, of course, there's workers' compensation, which is constantly increasing, or it was in those days anyway. And again, going back to the principle that's so important for people to understand. Remember, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, this is the thing you have to keep in mind. One thing, and this will be a successful talk: consumers pay all taxes. Corporations do not pay tax. Okay? Corporations may collect the tax, they may remit the tax, but ultimately whatever the corporation, whatever the company pays, simply gets recovered in the cost of the product. All right, enough. We're going to go for a break. We are going to be back in 2 minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Please don't go away.
Just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me.
And welcome back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, July the 5th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and I do appreciate you sticking with us. We've been talking about inflation, and I was talking a little bit about some of the history of my personal experience with the federal government and how it would increase prices. That was the result of its increase in taxes that had been built into the price of products, etc. This is going back, my personal experiences in the 70s and the 80s of the last century. I can't believe I can actually say that. But yeah, that's what was happening at the time. And again, remember, consumers pay taxes. Corporations don't pay taxes. They simply collect taxes and they remit taxes. They move money around, etc. But ultimately, it's the consumer that pays the tax. So what does all of this have to do with inflation? Well, I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it was very easy at that time, and it remains very easy today for government to take steps, whether they're through increased regulation, increasing requirements, more red tape, more regulatory burden placed on businesses, plus fees, taxes that are not obvious because they're built in. For instance, we have in Canada today the carbon tax, and more regulations that just kicked in on July the 1st. The new clean fuel standards, all of which increase the prices of fuel. And increasing the price of fuel increases the cost of getting food from the farm or the processing plant to the grocery store. So when you increase the price of fuel, when you increase the price of energy, that kicks the price of everything up, not just transportation, everything. A grocery store has to heat. They have to also use energy. So, and somebody's got to pay for all of this. And of course, it's the consumer that pays for this. But they don't, when you go to the grocery store and you get your grocery bill after you pay, you don't see a carbon tax. You don't see a higher tax on energy. You don't see X number of dollars dedicated to covering the cost of added regulations. Not just, of course, in groceries, but for everything. My point is this, ladies and gentlemen, there are lots of causes of inflation. Some has to do with things that are largely beyond the control of government. The value of the currency, somewhat under the control of the government, but there are aspects of this that are not necessarily under government control. There are things that can happen in the free market that add to the value and therefore the cost of a product or service that are beyond the control of the government. But there are many things that the government is doing itself that add to the cost of goods and services to consumers. And I used the thing about the story about this manufacturer sales tax in the 70s and the 80s as an illustration of what the government does behind the scenes, under the table, behind closed doors, in order to generate revenue that it needs because they're not managing their finances so well. So all of this kicks in, and what do they blame it on, ladies and gentlemen? And this is really, I think, the kicker. It gets blamed on this mysterious, ephemeral idea of inflation. Inflation is happening. Of course, inflation in Canada is largely due to government taxes, increasing taxes that you only know about because some of the political parties make a stink about it. But that's what's really driving inflation. That's what's really driving inflation in the food sector. Now, let me move away from that for just a second. We'll circle back to that in a minute. But let me also address this idea of giving a government rebate in order to help you pay for what you're having difficulty affording in the first place. One of the things that causes inflation is when demand is not met by production. So, in the housing industry, if we're not building enough houses to meet the demand, then the price of housing on the open market is going to go up because people are going to bid higher and higher and higher for housing. You want to deal with affordable housing? Reduce regulation, reduce the red tape, build, baby, build. But that can only happen if the federal government or the provincial governments and the municipal government get together and they do two things. Cut the costs, reduce the red tape that's involved in building housing, and most importantly, find some way, please, of coordinating between immigration and housing construction. Because right now there is no coordination. So the federal government has these immigration numbers, and this is not me being anti-immigrant. I'm just stating an economic fact. The fact is that if you want more people coming to this country, then you better be prepared to ensure that the housing stock is sufficient to meet those numbers coming in and all of the infrastructure that comes along with building communities. But there is no coordination. And so we have a situation now where, at least in the purchasing market, the housing buying market, where we have a shortage of housing. And where you have a shortage of housing, a high demand and a low supply, that's going to push prices up. But again, that's government policy. The government's not going out of its way to push prices up, but that's the result of what the government is doing. That's why I'm against massive immigration. It's got nothing to do with changing the culture. Those are interesting arguments, okay? And that's a debate to have, and I do have some concerns in that area. But the real immediate problem is we aren't building enough housing. We aren't developing enough urban infrastructure in order to house all of the people that we are bringing into this country. Just a fact. That's government policy driving housing prices up. And of course, as fewer and fewer people can afford to purchase their own house, or even to find a house to purchase in a neighborhood where they want to raise their children, they're forced to rent. So we have now a shortage of rental properties as well. And of course, in those areas where rent is not regulated, rent prices are not regulated, then you're going to see rental prices escalating as well. Now, here's what happens, okay? As with this rebate, the government steps in and says, we're going to give you money in order to help you make ends meet, in order to help you to afford housing, to afford your rent, to afford your groceries, all based on compassion. I'm not criticizing the motivation in it, but you need to be aware that when we do that, we are mitigating the effect of higher prices. And what is the effect of higher prices is a reduction in demand. That's how the free market works. And so when we help people to continue to buy more groceries, rather than cutting back on their groceries, all we're doing is we're continuing to fuel demand. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should be cutting back on their groceries. I'm just talking about certain economic facts. And so again, you force demand, you force high demand through government programs, and high demand and low production, and we have a serious production problem. I haven't even touched on that, and we're not going to today, but we have a serious production problem in this country. Okay, productivity in this country has been falling for many years now. And if we're not producing, okay, I don't know how you expect you're going to generate wealth. But it doesn't come from the government. Remember, every dollar that the government taxes, out of the economy, okay, every dollar that the government injects into the economy, I should say, through some sort of rebate, through some sort of, I don't know, program, subsidy, whatever, every dollar the government injects into the economy to help people make ends meet, to stimulate economic activity, that's a dollar that the government has to tax out of the economy at some point in time. And it's absolutely the truth that if you can stimulate economic activity by injecting money into the economy, then the converse of that must be true as well. You are going to suppress economic activity by taxing that money out. And how the government gets around that is they borrow the money. Well, we're not taxing money out, we're borrowing it. But borrowed money, my friends, is deferred taxation. At some point in time, people pay higher taxes in order to continue to pay and service the debt that has been accumulated. And what does that mean? Inflation. But of course, the government blames it all on some mysterious forces of economic activity that we have no control over. And so inflation is a problem. I know, we're going to give you a rebate. Aside from the fact that, as I've already said, this rebate is not enough to actually do anything significant to help people. But if it was, the more effective the rebate is, the more that it contributes to the cycle of inflation that it's supposed to be addressing. It's government policy, ladies and gentlemen. And all of this comes down to a very simple solution. Less government. Okay? This is not an ideological statement. I'm just talking about economic facts, ladies and gentlemen. We have to have smaller government, less taxation, less regulation, more free enterprise, more personal responsibility, get the state out of our pockets and off our backs. Now, I'm not a libertarian, I'm a conservative. I believe that there's a role for government to play in a free and democratic society. Absolutely. I'm not anti-government, but our government is doing too much today, and it's causing irreparable harm to our society in so many ways. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to go for a break again, so stay with us. When we come back, this day in history. Stay tuned. We'll be back at the Joseph Ben-Ami Show in a couple of minutes. And welcome back to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, July the 5th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thanks for sticking with us. And of course, as always, or not always, but we certainly have been doing this lately, as we head into the home stretch, this day in history. Now, you know, there are always so many things that we could talk about when it comes to history. And some of it's very serious. Some of it is very lighthearted. Today, I thought that we would take somewhat of a more lighthearted approach. Because on this day in history, July the 5th, 1946, was the introduction, the unveiling, no pun intended, of the bikini. That's right, July 5th, 1946, French designer Louis Réard unveiled a daring two-piece swimsuit at the Piscine Molitor in Paris, which was a popular swimming pool at that time. There were actually two French designers who came up with swimsuits like a bikini. One of them, as I already said, was Louis Réard. The other was a fellow by the name of Jacques Heim. And Jacques Heim developed his competing prototype and called it the Atom, A-T-O-M. And that's actually important to remember, for just keep that in mind for a second. And he advertised it as the world's smallest bathing suit. But Réard's swimsuit was in fact significantly smaller than Heim's. Okay. In fact, Réard promoted his as the smaller than the world's smallest bathing suit. So a little bit of a competition between the two of these individuals. But he went on to offer proof of his claim, because he declared that a two-piece bathing suit was not a genuine bikini unless it could be pulled through a wedding ring. Now, apparently, Mr. Réard had difficulty debuting his bathing suit, the bikini, because he couldn't find any professional model to model it. And so he had to go to a exotic dancer by the name of Micheline Bernardini from the Casino de Paris, who had no qualms whatsoever about showing up nude or close to nude in public. And so she modeled the bikini for the first time on July the 5th, 1946, at the Piscine Molitor in Paris. Now, the bikini was scandalous at the time, and so different countries, Spain and Italy, for instance, actually passed laws banning the use of a bikini on public beaches. But of course, they had to capitulate to the changing mores of the time. Well, maybe they didn't have to, but that's what they did. The bikini did not really come into fashion in the United States until the 1960s, which was very odd. It was very popular in the 1950s in Europe, but it was not popular in the United States until mass media, the movies, Hollywood, started to promote it in some of their movies. And in particular, I'm thinking of the movies that starred Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon, and the whole California surfing culture with the Beach Boys, etc. And of course, let's not forget the hit song by Brian Hyland, Itsy Bitsy Teensy Weensy. Oh no, hang on a second. Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini. Now, what is the origin of the term bikini? What is the meaning of it? And how does this tie into the competitor that Mr. Heim's bathing suit? Well, the bikini was named after the Bikini Islands. Bikini Island is an atoll in the Eastern Pacific. It is a coral reef, and it was the site of 23 nuclear tests by the United States. One of these tests, in fact, I think it was the first, had actually taken place in Bikini Island only a few days before the unveiling of the bikini bathing suit. And so that was the whole origin of the term bikini. It was to commemorate the atomic tests on Bikini Island. And of course, not to be outdone, Jacques Heim, when he wanted to find the name for his bathing suit that he was developing, he called it the Atom. So that's the connection between the two. All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the end of another hour-long show. I appreciate you having tuned in and participated. Check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word, without a hyphen. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our email updates. Check out our my regular columns. You'll see I have some of them, including one that deals with a little bit of what we talked about today and the whole idea of inflation and some of the causes of it, and how government uses the term inflation to really obfuscate and mask their responsibility, direct responsibility for increasing prices to consumers. So you'll want to check that out. And while you're there, if you use Amazon regularly, click on the Amazon link to take yourself to your own Amazon page, your own purchasing page, and make your purchases that way, because that way we make a little teensy bit of commission, helps to make sure that the Joseph Ben-Ami Show remains free of charge to all of you out there. And one final note, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching the show on YouTube or Rumble, please subscribe. Costs you nothing, but it adds to our availability out there in the cyberspace. Okay, so that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you tuning in. Join us again tomorrow night for the Joseph Ben-Ami Show, where we speak truth to power, and anyone who will listen.